So in this part 3 question, the candidate was asked about the countryside versus the city. Compare them, contrast them, etc. So what's the countryside like? Is it any different? What's the difference between the countryside and the city, etc. So this is connected to part 2's question about a plant. Firstly, what are the features of living in the countryside? Listen to her first answer. I want you to think about the vocabulary she uses and the structure of her answer. How could they be better?
Firstly, fresh air. There are so many horrible smells in the city. I don't like to breathe there. I can never breathe fresh air like in the countryside. And not many people wear face masks in the countryside. I think it's an escape from the city, so people in the countryside are more friendly as well. There is less crime, so it is safer.
In part 3, it is better that you do most of the talking and the examiner does very little. So the examiner should not ask a lot of questions in part 3. You should keep talking. Of course, he's going to ask you 3 or 4 questions, but you don't want him to ask you 10, 11, 12 questions. So this means you're not speaking long enough and you're not speaking enough. And the examiner needs to interrupt in order to get you to keep speaking. Remember, this is an examination for you, not the examiner's English, your English. So you should be doing most of the talking, especially in part 3. So the first answer by the candidate was okay, but it's never going to be a 6, a 6.5, a 7 or higher. So here is the second answer given by the candidate. The first time not so good, the second time, see what you think.
The first thing that comes to my mind is fresh air, because living in the city, you forget how revitalizing clean air is due to all the fumes and unpleasant odors that are constantly around in the city. They can really make you want to hold your breath all the time. When was the last time you actually took a deep breath of air and it felt good? And you don't see many paranoid people wearing face masks in the countryside. Secondly, I would say the peace and quiet are an integral part of the countryside. So people often go there to get away from the constant noise of cars, or strangers in the street, or loud parties at night. So the countryside is a much needed escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. The locals are often friendlier too. When they pass you in the street, they often say hello to you. But if you do that in the city, people would think you had a screw loose. And on account of the fact that fewer people live in the countryside, there is less crime. Generally speaking, a lot of elderly people reside in the countryside. And at least to me, it seems that grandparents are less inclined to break into your home or mug you in the street.
So in this second answer, the candidate extended her answers with examples, with explanations. Sometimes she gave a lot of explanation and one example, other times explanation and a lot of examples. But she used that structure. She extended her answer. She said something, explained, and then gave examples, and the examiner would understand. One example was when she said, and you don't see many paranoid people wearing face masks in the countryside. Good words used in the example, but it was an example and it painted a picture in the examiner's head. He imagined this situation, paranoid people with face masks in the countryside. Okay, so all in all, it was a good example, and it was just one example. But she did give lots of examples of how she found the people in the countryside to be a lot friendlier and nicer. So she didn't just say, oh, the people there are really nice and kind. She gave examples of that niceness, that friendliness. And of course, she used the sentence frames that we were talking about earlier. For example, she said, it seems to me that. She also said, the first thing that comes to mind is. So these are good sentence frames also. And they sound natural and it's good vocabulary if you're speaking. And she used some of the collocations we were talking about. She said peace and quiet, of course, but she said words like, phrases like hustle and bustle, hold your breath, hustle and bustle. So again, if you say this correctly, this makes the examiner listen closely to what you're saying, because you say it once, maybe it's memorized, but you say other things like peace and quiet, and the examiner starts to raise your vocabulary mark. And then, of course, if you do this, plus you use the sentence frames, like it seems to me that, the first thing that comes to mind is, that's even better, and your vocabulary shows a pattern of being strong and comes up. And then finally, you use some good general formal academic type of words, then that's even better. So did she do that? Well, she did use a lot of words that are much better than basic, even in the example we talked about paranoid people. Paranoid? Okay. So these kind of words throughout. She said other words. There was a couple of phrases that she said that particularly stuck in my mind as an examiner. For example, an integral part of. This is a very good collocative phrase that means like an important part of, an essential part of, an integral part of. The words go together and it's quite formal sounding. It could be used when you go to university also. Good phrase. She used it, so I'm keeping my mark for her vocabulary quite high. Another example she said was to be less inclined to do something. That's another good example of formal language. What does it mean? It means to be less likely to do something, but to be less inclined to do something. More formal phrase. Sounds pretty good to me. It sounds quite natural. It sounds natural and also as part of speaking at university. It's that kind of language, you know. And so it's much better than saying less likely to do something. Less likely to do something's okay. It's not terrible. But to be less inclined to do something, much better. And there are a lot of other words she used. If you listen again or you look at the words highlighted, you will see quite consistent use of better, much better than basic vocabulary. Okay. Of course, you don't need, as I've said already, you don't need to use hundreds of these words, but a lot of these words, like less inclined to do something, you could use these words in lots of answers, not just for plants. You can use words like this in many, many of your answers. If you practice using them correctly in your speech, you will get a better mark in the vocabulary. In my next video, I'll be giving you ultimate insight into how to break down your answer for part 2 of the speaking test. See you then.